Tell Day, May 25th, 2018. This is episode 91 of the Unseen Podcast, and this is your host, Paul Carr. Joining us on the Unseen Podcast in this episode are Sam Lichtenstein.
Hello from New York City.
Patrick Festa.
Hello from New Jersey.
And Nick Nielsen.
Hello from Portland, Oregon.
So, it's possible we join one fourth person later, but no guarantee of that. Okay. The seed topic is dying lost languages. Go. Talk amongst yourselves.
I actually have a question for Nick, because I was reading your first comments in this thread, and I'm trying to remember not exactly what you said, but you were talking about how to preserve it. You know, does people have to be alive to preserve a language? I don't think so. I don't think that's really a possibility. I mean, it may be slightly possible, but I think it is at least important, if you're going to preserve it, to have both written and audio recordings of the spoken language.
Well, we've got because of our audio-visual technology, we've got the quick and nasty version, and people who are the last speakers of a language, they tend to be recorded before they pass away. So there's some kind of a record, which is better than no record at all.
Right.
But of course, one of the issues is whether a language is going to be preserved as a living language or not. And people who think that it's important that a language be a living language, they are presumably implicitly arguing that if you allow our language stock to be greatly decreased, that this was going to impoverish certainly the linguistic richness of the human experience, and perhaps also other aspects of the human experience. If we hold with a strong formulation of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, by which language is at least partially responsible for the construction of an individual's Weltanschauung, or picture of the world, then each language represents a unique view of the world. Now, there are very few people today who hold the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, but there are many people who have some kind of connection to a weaker formulation, where language certainly does influence the way we see things. And if you argue that it's valuable, I think what's implicitly being said is that we need to maintain the diversity of linguistic communities and not just preserve a language in Rosetta Stone fashion. Although, once again, presumably it's better that we preserve a Rosetta Stone to a language than we lose it entirely.
Right. I mean, I didn't realize that. Yeah, I imagine, though, that it would be up to the peoples of that language to continue the living language in some fashion. But
you have to have a minimum size of a viable community, and they have to want.
Since that is questionably an improbable undertaking, I would argue that in the case that it is a dying language and you recognize it to be one, I would argue that it is important to preserve it, at least even for just simply as an anthropological reason. And not only that, to give you an example of a language that is not a dying language, but a language that is somewhat obscured by now, but it's still widely used in the scientific community and whatnot. And it's also the root of many languages, for example, is Latin, just to give you an obscure, and it's not like we go around speaking Latin, but it was important to preserve that language. And it is preserved. In fact, it's part of a lot of other languages.
It's preserved, but it's a dead language. It's not spoken by a living community of people.
Yeah, it's a very well-documented language as well.
Yes, it's a very well-documented language.
It was the English of the Middle Ages. Right. That's what, at least in Europe.
I mean, there's a sense in which you could say it doesn't count as dead because people learn it and will continue learning it because there's a valuable literary tradition that they're interested in preserving, as well as important historical tradition, right? It's not at any risk of people stopping learning Latin anytime in the foreseeable future, I would say.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm in my layman's way. It's the only good example I had.
Well, like you could contrast it with the case of Welsh, for example, right? Where like, I mean, there is some. I'm sure there's some Welsh literature, but it's like,
oh, there is, yes,
but it's not like as, if you compare the number of classicists who are interested in like Cicero and all the famous Latin orders and poets and stuff, to like, I feel like Gaelic and Welsh ancient literature is probably a much more niche academic specialty. And so if you imagine that people, living Welsh speakers all gradually stop learning it, you can imagine I could conceive of Welsh going away in 200 years.
Oh, I think less than that, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, the article that Paul sent the link to said that the Welsh number of people fluently speaking Welsh falls by 7,000, but I don't. Did you see how many actual speakers there are at the present time?
I think 7,000 is the total number of people who are currently fluent in Welsh, which is tiny.
But I'm imagining that even after like normal people stop speaking it, there would be it would be academically preserved. There would be scholars who would keep alive the study of the language.
Welsh is very well documented, as is Gaelic, as is Cornish, and the other Celtic languages. Both Irish and Scots Gaelic, Old Irish, all super well documented. But then it just becomes a matter of scientific interest, right? It's not alive. I was in New Mexico recently, and I spoke to a Jicarilla Apache, which are the folks who live in the reservation in north of New Mexico, and he told me that he's one of the very few Apaches left who speak fluent Jicarilla Apache. And because there's really...
Is that like a subdialect, or?
I suppose it's a dialect of, compared to what the other Apaches in the area speak.
But was he saying Apache language as a whole is dying, or just his particular?
Well, I think probably most indigenous North American languages are dying or dead. And out in the Southwest, there have been a little bit more preservation because they're a bit more isolated from English speakers or Spanish speakers in the case of a lot of them. But they're still, I mean, there's, to engage in commerce, you have to speak English or Spanish. And so there's not a lot of, there's not this lively market to keep the language going, and that's where I think it's failing. And I think I don't know about indigenous languages throughout the Americas, but I know there were hundreds of them at one point, maybe thousands, and they're now mostly gone.
According to a 2007 survey, there were 14,000 speakers of Western Apache. And according to that article you linked to about Welsh, there are 310,600 people aged 3 or over living in Wales who could speak Welsh fluently.
Oh, that's many. Okay, that's actually still pretty healthy. Yeah.
It's a large enough community you could see it going on, but certainly the Native American languages are highly threatened, as are the great diversity of languages in Africa, and probably also, I would guess, in Asia, but I don't know much about the language family, so I don't know how threatened those are.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's my opinion, at least in worst case scenario, if the language is dying, and you couldn't possibly be part of the creating some kind of living, entity to continue the language. At the very least, if you're that interested, you need to preserve it for at least for scientific purposes and other purposes too. To stretch the issue, let's go into a little bit of science fiction here. Let's take a look at the language experts on Star Trek. Especially the new Enterprise. Well, it's not new anymore. What's her name? Soshi. She's the linguist, and she's in charge of creating the first, universal translator. Now, while Earth languages and in the thousands at one time may not seem any big deal to anybody, it just may be possible that if there are other humanoid intelligent life out there, it might be similarities in the way we speak. It may not be. I mean, differences in air pressure could make a different sound, hearing level. Who knows? But the point is that the more you have to go by, the more in the database, the more you can use to help understand other peoples that you may be totally obscured from at one time or another.
So that's an interesting argument in favor of preservation. I wonder, so an analogy might be to the preservation of endangered species, right?
Yeah.
So you could also make a kind of xenobiological argument for species preservation, that who knows, maybe we'll find some terrestrial analog of an extraterrestrial species, and that will be somehow useful for the study of that species.
Or
Somehow I doubt that's the main motivation.
Diversity is really the
right. I
there.
think Paul's right that, like, if you ask environmentalists why they think species preservation is important, they wouldn't throw out the aliens as the primary motivation. But
right.
But on the other hand, if you look at people's revealed preferences, like their actual behavior, species preservation doesn't seem to be something that most humans care that much about.
Well, I mean, a lot of the species that have gone extinct are, beetles, or, a slight variation of a hummingbird or something like that.
No one feels bad about those at all, right? I mean,
yeah.
They're not charismatic megafauna.
Yeah, we only care about the cute furry ones, sorry. Or at least
the big interesting ones.
Yeah, or the pretty feathered ones.
Squirrels.
the economically significant species like bees used in pollination.
Yeah.
I've heard that in some places in China the pollution is so bad that entire areas have been denuded of bees, and that people actually go into the fields and hand pollinate plants that have previously been pollinated by bees, and that's a serious problem with economic ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have what's called a regional extinction, you can clean up that area and you could reintroduce the species, and you could probably revive the ecosystem to a significant degree. And similarly, with the regional extinction of a language, if Spanish went extinct in Spain, there would still be plenty of Spanish speakers in South America, and the language would go on because it's a global language. But if an endemic language or an endemic species goes extinct and it's not to be found elsewhere, then that is really the end of the road for it, and you have permanently lost either biodiversity or linguistic diversity to extend that parallelism.
But on the other hand,
is there a problem?
Biodiversity case, we know that that's just life, right?
Is there a problem with like dialects? For example, I knew some Spaniards. The native Spanish language is far different than the, say, Mexican Spanish or the South American Spanish. Or
the pronunciation is certainly different, and the idioms are different.
Yeah.
Well, it's not surprising, right? I mean, English is like that too.
Yeah, there's English spoken in Australia, New Zealand, South Asia, and they all, some of them sound quite different. And if you
and Brazilian Portuguese and Portuguese are
and yet they could all understand each other. I've watched a Portuguese, an Italian, and a Spanish guy. I don't know I think he was Puerto Rican, speaking their own languages to each other. And every once in a while, they would pause and say, "Wait, what did you mean by that?" Kind of like idea.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they were actually understanding each other.
People who speak Spanish can learn Portuguese very quickly, and vice versa.
But like, for example, English, the England English, the Queen's English. I'll give you an example. I have the Harry Potter collection up there from the British version, and just as out of curiosity, I was reading some passages, and there's some things that are completely different, but it's not like I didn't understand it. I perfectly understood it. I thought it was kind of funny, a little giggle here and there, like when you say somebody bolted out of there, you know what that means to you in America, right? But they'll say something like he haired out of there, as in the large rabbit thing, he haired out of there. Instead of saying bolted, he haired. And I thought that was kind of uniquely strange. Not that I didn't understand it, not that I wouldn't be able to carry on a conversation with a person who spoke like that.
But
so
Try talking to a Scotsman, though. Then
Yeah.
I have many times.
So is there some underground part of the publishing industry we don't know about, where they take British English books and then people go through and rephrase the idioms and change the spellings to make them acclimated to the
I've
Well, you
heard
have to
of
understand, J.K. Rowling was an English teacher in UK. So, I mean, in fact, I think she was born in Scotland or Ireland. Scotland. Anyway,
Scotland, I think.
She's from
so
Scotland.
they
Yeah.
published it by one publisher, and over here, Scholastic published it. And they're the ones that made her change the name of the first book. But nevertheless, there. I know this podcast is not going to have the camera on, but I think if I can show you the black ones up there, the black ones on my right, your left. I don't know, whatever, are the Harry Potter collection British.
The serious looking books on the shelf up there, top
Yeah,
shelf.
they look much more sophisticated than the American edition.
Yeah, well, they are.
Yeah.
They do. They really do.
Well, yeah.
But yeah. So they are different. Like the Philosopher's Stone is, the Sorcerer's Stone is the Philosopher's Stone, and that's what it was supposed to be. But
I'm surprised that's
Scholastic
interesting.
insisted that she changed the name.
I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah. Because it's when she wrote these books, she did a lot of research into the ancient magics and all the magical creatures and the castles of England and all that stuff, all that ancient witchcraft and stuff like that. And the Philosopher's Stone is the stone that immortal stone. But for some reason, Scholastic publishers are like, no, I want you to change the name to the Sorcerer's Stone. And she didn't want to do it at first, but she ended up doing it.
And who are we to second guess their marketing wisdom? Because it worked out pretty well.
Oh yeah, I mean,
we have the Full Metal Jacket.
that's not a huge cultural divide to cross. I don't think.
Yeah.
Well, the Philosopher's Stone is an alchemist thing. So we have. I said jacket, but I meant
Right.
Full Metal Alchemist thing.
Right.
It's a funny case because the Sorcerer's Stone is a completely made up phrase, as far as I know. Whereas
Right.
Yeah, and by interpolating that in place of the Philosopher's Stone, you lose that historical continuity. Well, maybe
Exactly.
they think
That's what I'm getting.
Americans don't appreciate that historical continuity. But it unless you do the research and the change is made, you're deprived of the opportunity to even see if you recognize that continuity.
Yeah, well, that's why I referenced the Harry Potter, because that's exactly right, Nick. In other words, there's a historical continuity that is lost. Translation is lost. Why Scholastic made her do it, I don't know. But
Well, a lot of things get dumbed down for the American market.
No, not even dumbed down, just translated. But they only made one set of movies, right? And they were hits everywhere.
It's an alchemy thing. Before chemistry, there was alchemy. And that's what the Philosopher's Stone is supposed to be. It had to do with magic and everything. That's why she was right. That's what she was writing about. There's a lot of references to the sword. What do you call it? Sword, and there's a lot.
Sword
of
and the Stone.
Yeah,
you talk about the sword and the stone in Arthurian mythology.
There's the sword. What's his name? Sword. King Arthur's.
There's a sword in the second book that is very important.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of references to all kinds of magical creatures, from chimeras to
griffins. Yeah.
Griffins. It's Gryffindor, right?
The plants that scream when you pull them up out of the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, things like that. So I mean,
Well, there's stuff like that in the Wizard of Oz.
They actually made a museum of her writings. I don't know why. I didn't mean to get into her writing. It's just that it was about the language, about the change in the language.
Well, but there are slight variations. But and also, the target audience for those books was primarily middle schoolers, and they all have, and middle schoolers in the U.S. have different curriculum than middle schoolers in the UK, so they know different things. But my daughter was a middle schooler. Actually, when Harry Potter first came out, she was younger than that, but she absorbed all those books, quite happily, and it was so, as were all her friends, and it was
an old weird people like me.
But this can shine a light on issues of cultural loss in regional language extinction or the extinction of dialects. So
right, that's why I brought it up.
say British English goes extinct and American English continues, or vice versa, American English goes extinct and British English continues, which involves the greater loss, and probably because of England's connection to the old world. There's probably far more continuities toward both previous languages and to the classics written in English to British English as compared to American English.
I'm going to call BS on that sort of counterfactual, just because in practice, the sorts of languages that go extinct are not like British English. Like we're really talking about much smaller populations.
But I think he's just giving an example, just like I gave the example of the.
It's a weak for instance, but we could take what Paul mentioned earlier, the difference between Brazilian Portuguese and Portuguese, which is spoken by far fewer people than English, or I'm sure there must be other good examples of languages that could be partially preserved or preserved in one form. So when I was thinking about this topic, when we started out exchanging messages about this before the show, and an interesting thought experiment came to me, which was the possibility of the founder effect in the future of languages. So say you had a relatively marginal language that was, say you create a starship to go and colonize another planetary system, and you send everybody on the starship speaks Portuguese. So Portuguese is not a highly represented, but it's still not a rare language in the Earth. But it's a minority language. But obviously, when that got to another solar system and it built, if it was able to build a successful civilization there, that civilization would be majority speaking Portuguese because of the founder effect, and essentially transferred over into linguistics. And if that went on then to spread to further places out in the universe, then you could get a very marginal language that expands disproportionately due to the founder effect of those speakers who are the first to establish themselves on a cosmological basis, as it were.
Yeah, that seems plausible. I guess what brings to mind the Kim Stanley Robinson Mars books, where, it's not so implausible to imagine Russian being a much more important language in early solar, say Mars or lunar colonies than it is on Earth, proportionally, because Russia has a disproportionately advanced space program, right? But it still seems implausible to me that you'd see like a truly in terms of like founder effect type things about like what we're like, will we detect a kind of linguistically non-representative subpopulation? Seems unlikely, right? It seems like
it seems very unlikely, although I can give one possible speculation. But obviously the most widely spoken languages are associated with the largest industrial bases, and if we assume that any settlement off Earth is going to be the base based on the economic resources of a language associated with a large industrial base, obviously you're going to be facing something like English, Chinese, Russian, etc., as the possible languages that would be propagated. However, I can imagine somebody with a utopian scheme of mind, and when they build their generational starship, they decide they're going to have everybody speak Esperanto because they think that's the rational solution to the problem of linguistic diversity. I'm not advocating this, but I can imagine it happen.
Maybe like if you imagine India, they might, for political reasons, choose to seed their starship with speakers of all the hundreds of languages that are spoken in India, and that during the journey, some sort of pidgin combination of them would emerge as the lingua franca, right?
Yeah, good point.
Well, English. They almost all speak English.
All the astronauts do.
Yeah. I that's like I deal with international people all the time, from Europe and from India, from Asia, and although they sometimes have a thick accent, their English is really good. It's grammatically correct. Um, yeah, and in my field, for example, there are a lot of Asians, and whilst you could tell that they didn't grow up natively speaking English, they speak it very well. And I think throughout much of India, South Asia, English is spoken because the British, used to run that whole area. English education is very common. And so I would not be surprised if you put a bunch of people from the Indian subcontinent in a spaceship and launched them to another star, if they didn't end up speaking some weird dialect of English by the time they arrived.
Absolutely, and by the time they arrived, it would be sufficiently different than English spoken back on Earth. It would be nearly incomprehensible,
Well,
like Mandarin speakers and Cantonese speakers.
I've been trying to get my daughter to read Shakespeare, right? And she struggles with it, and that's only, I guess it's 500 years of English evolution since Shakespeare, and she really finds it really difficult to pick up on Shakespeare. And I have to admit that, it takes, I told her, you got to take your time and develop an ear for it. It will take you a little while before you really can follow it. And she's like, that's a lot of work. Why would I?
There's this linguist at Columbia, John McWhorter, who penned a controversial op-ed a year or two ago, advocating that Shakespeare be translated into English. Modern English.
Most of the texts of Shakespeare have been modernized in spelling and punctuation, and even some in phraseology. Because when I want to quote Shakespeare, I always check the first folio edition first, just to see how far the modern editions have drifted from the first folio.
Well, there've been a lot of emendations. Yeah,
that's actually a good example of because of the evolution of a language. Is happening constantly. As we speak. Excuse the pun. Shakespeare is a good example. I've even got an old Sherlock Holmes book up here. It's only 100 or so years old. Not the book itself, but the stories in it. And I love Sherlock Holmes. And when I started reading this, I'm like, okay, I put it down because I didn't like it. In other words, it sounded so strange to me that I just didn't like it. I'd rather watch the newer modern Sherlock Holmes stuff. So, I mean, in a sense, that is a preservation. That is an active preservation to preserve those old Shakespeare books, for example, is an act of preserving our old English. Not that English is dying out, but the old, it is changing.
Yeah. Well, only scholars who study a particular period know the period pronunciations of Chaucerian Middle English or Shakespearean English, etc. And there are people who specialize in just getting the pronunciation right for attempts to give original performances as close as possible to the original.
Right.
I think another funny analogy to think about is the case of computer languages. And it's different because while some very old computer languages are still around, for example, COBOL from the 50s, which still runs a huge fraction of banking software, something like 90% of ATM transactions will go through a COBOL system at some point. But no one is romantic about the fact that there are these vestiges of old languages,
There's probably somebody.
There's probably somebody, but by and large, people would be thrilled if it would just die off for good,
Should we be romantic about COBOL?
COBOL is pretty horrible.
It's sort of historically important, and it comes out of Grace Hopper's work.
Yeah.
It's a direct evolution, and she was a very cool lady, important female foremother of modern computer science, but it's just not a good language. And maybe Western Apache is also just not a good language. We should be happy to let it die. I mean,
there's definitely
kind of an intentionally provocative way of putting it, but you know what I mean. Like in biological,
there's a selective effect that goes on. There's also the military and political and economic power has attached to a language has a lot of effect on its sway and its reach. But there's also the fact that the simpler language it is, the easier it is going to be for other people to study it. And that's why it's very unlikely that the languages like Chinese and Japanese are going to be widely spoken outside of those who learned it as their mother tongue.
It's not so much widely spoken, but widely written and read. Japanese is really hard to learn, to read and write. To speak is not so bad, but in fact, the Western ear picks up Japanese pretty well. Chinese is much more difficult, but there's something like 4 writing systems in Japanese.
Yeah, hiragana, katakana, the kanji characters,
and romaji, which is easy for us, but kanji is crazy. I mean, they consider the basic set is like 6,000 characters. So it's just
wow.
6,000. They have an entertainment show on Japanese television where they show people the current kanji letters, and then they have to guess what the original pictogram was and the origins of the symbol.
Yeah, which if you don't grow up with that, you never get that.
unless you're a scholar of the language, it's not obvious. It's not easy.
I mean, you can learn. I briefly learned hiragana and katakana, which are not hard, but kanji takes years.
But in the 80s, when everybody thought that Japan was going to be taking over the world, it was very stylish. Just like wealthy parents today want their kids to learn Chinese or Mandarin, I should say. Wealthy parents in the 80s wanted their kids to learn Japanese when people were predicting that Japanese were going to run the world. So these things go in cycles of trends of whatever people think is going to be over the horizon, geostrategically speaking.
Well, in a sense, going back to the preservation of languages, in a sense, those rich people, parents are, I've seen a few of those videos where these children are in China and speaking fluent Mandarin and stuff like that to and they're completely blonde-haired, blue-eyed American, kind of person. But anyway, in a sense, that's a task in preservation of a language to begin with, because you're spreading it.
It's a propagation of a language, certainly, and the more a language is propagated, the greater chance it has of surviving and being represented.
Right.
But so to go back to this point about how bad should you feel about when one goes extinct in the ecology, in the biological ecological context, I think there's at least a defensible perspective that one shouldn't be so romantic about it, or to impute morality onto it. To assume that a loss of biodiversity is a self-evidently bad thing from some sort of grand cosmic ethical perspective, because we are but a blip in the history of this planet, and species came and went before us, and they'll come and go after us, and it is what it is. And yet on the other hand, there's this very strong intuition that imputing some sort of teleology to the planetary evolution, like the more cool stuff that evolves, you never know what'll turn out.
I see this more kind of a scientific thing and a possible point of reference and research and future communication with something we never heard, and it might sound like this, or if it sounds like that, then, or if it looks like that, if it looks like a duck, it is a duck, kind of thing, but I don't think there's any, for me, it's not a romantic thing, it's not a moral thing, it's not I think it's just a almost a astronomers look at the stars kind of thing, linguists like to look at languages in there, and historians at the same time.
Right, but the astronomers don't feel bad when a star goes supernova.
No, they feel pretty good about it, actually. No, but you know what I'm saying. It in a historical sense, and for a reference sense, and for a lot of other scientific and or historical anthropology. I don't know why I can think it, but I can't come off my tongue. Thank you. For reasons, I think it's actually important. As far as a moral, no, I don't have any romantic.
Well, let me give you an extreme case just as a thought experiment. Let's say our grandchildren throughout the world only speak English. how would you feel about that? I mean, English is kind of taken over much of the world. Now, I don't really know ever really will completely dominate all languages, but if there was just one language everybody in the world spoke fluently, and the other languages are considered little local curiosities, would that be a bad thing?
For me, it would.
I think what I would actually feel most impoverished by would be the sort of loss of cultural heritage, right? Through the great, the films of Truffaut or Fellini, like
Or
great works
Kurosawa.
Kurosawa, great works of art that were conceived by a certain person at a certain time and place, and to go back to Nick's Sapir-Whorf type thing, that their linguistic context was somehow an essential component of who they were, and so they'll never be quite the same in translation.
Right. You know what they say, it gets lost in translation kind of thing, yeah.
And like watching
Good movie.
Seven Samurai dubbed just does, it's not good, right?
No, yeah, you have to subtitles are.
Yeah. I've got this cartoon that's it's about the World War II and nuclear. It's something with fireflies. It's an animation, and I first watched it in English sub so I can understand what they're saying. But when I watched it in Japanese, I didn't have to know what they were saying. The whole sound was different. The whole inflection, everything was. I knew what was going on, and I didn't have to know exactly what they were saying.
Yeah,
sort of like the
fireflies. I'm sorry.
Are you thinking of the animated cartoon guy? I can't remember who did Spirited Away.
Miyazaki or something like that.
Miyazaki.
I forget. It's been a while. I got the DVD. It's in the other room.
There's some of the stuff you do not have to speak the language to appreciate a good proportion of what's being shown.
Yeah,
but certainly,
I mean, just the voices, the voices of what they were saying. I'm sorry. It wasn't subtitled. It was. It was subtitled, but I meant they actually translated it in English, and I was listening to it, with English voices and all this stuff.
Yeah. Right.
And then I went to the subtitles and I listened to them speak their own and the actual actors who were doing the voices for the cartoon, and it was completely different for me. It was much better as long as I knew what they were saying, or even if I didn't know what they were saying, I didn't have to always.
Well, part of the problem with dubbing is that they often hire really terrible actors to do the dubbing.
Yeah, this wasn't so terrible, but it was definitely different. In other words, just because of the difference in language.
I can name one.
I feel like the loss of the cultural heritage is a thing, but I'm more skeptical about what Nick brought up originally, the stronger form with Sapir-Whorf, the idea that there would be modalities of thought that are actually inaccessible to this hypothetical future generation that only spoke English. Like, the
old adage of things getting lost in translation is
right. Not being able to read Basho in the original Japanese would be a loss, but would it just be a cultural loss, or would it be an ontological loss of a perspective on the world?
Yeah.
And if it is a profound loss of that kind, what ought to be done about it? What can be done about it? Or do we just have to be fatalistic about it and say, well, that's selection?
Well, I mean, let's face it. There were none of the languages that we have now were around 5,000 years ago. All languages, they are born, they live, and they die. It's part of.
And there have even been some very large-scale civilizations, the Roman Empire, for example, or even the Chinese Empire at various stages. They've uniformly failed to impose linguistic uniformity across large dominions. So I actually think it's not necessarily even a plausible scenario.
Oh yeah, I agree that it's unlikely.
But did they even try?
A linguistic monoculture.
I would argue with the imperial systems like the Roman Empire or the Baghdad Caliphate during the Islamic Golden Age. They ruled over a vast number of people with a vast number of languages. It was only important that the imperial officials spoke the official language, and they didn't really care what the majority of people spoke as long as they obeyed and didn't rebel.
So you're saying what could be new in the coming centuries is an economic impetus for a universal language.
Well, there's already a de facto pressure, just like we were saying earlier. Almost everybody speaks English.
But they also speak
If
their local languages.
they speak their local language first, and then if they're going to get into the sciences, they realize that if you publish a paper in English, it gets many more readers than if you publish a paper in another language, even another European language. I mean, you're going to get far more readers in English than French or German.
Huge fraction of Europeans under the age of, say, 40 speak English, but none of them stop speaking their own mother tongues as well. And that's what I think is less. That's where I think the scenario becomes less certain, which is just because you can have a global language for commerce and science, and even diplomacy and other things that are global in nature, without it supplanting local languages for everyday life and for cultural expression.
Well, let's take a step beyond Paul's thought experiment. Well, if you came back and your grandchildren, everybody all over the world only spoke English, say it's like that 100 years or 200 years, however implausibly, we take that as a thought experiment. If you came back then in 1,000 years, English would have adaptively radiated and become a great many different languages that were distantly based on the English we speak today.
Yeah, like Belter and Martian.
Yes, exactly.
Just like Latin was.
Or the pastiche that they have in A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah.
I think also important is the symbols. You were talking about the I didn't realize there was that many thousand symbols in certain Japanese, but the symbols, symbols, the first languages and the first symbols for sounds were created probably prehistory. We don't even know some of them, I'm sure. Let's take the ones that we do know, hieroglyphics, for example. I mean, I don't know them personally, but they had to sit down and decipher what these symbols meant and stuff like that. So it's a good thing we didn't actually lose that, but it was a task to learn how to what they meant and stuff like that. It's
to reconstruct it after the fact.
People who lived at that time.
It was a big job. It was a big job to puzzle out Egyptian. It was a very big job to only recently successfully completed to puzzle out Mayan, because the script is so difficult and so complicated and everything that's going on in it. And nobody has yet. Linear B has been translated, but Linear A has not ever been translated. The language represented on the Phaistos disc, which is an important archaeological find, has never been translated. And the language.
What is Linear A? I'm sorry. Tell me what Linear A and B are.
They were Eastern Mediterranean languages, I believe, associated with the ancient Crete and the civilization of Knossos.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just
no problem. But there's a wonderful book on linguistics called The Decipherment of Linear B, which is a classic of linguistic archaeology, as it were, trying to decipher the language. I was also beginning to say that there's a script preserved of the presumed language spoke in the Indus Valley civilization, and that has never been translated into modern languages, and nobody's been able to decipher it so far. So that may change.
So yeah, I mean, and we don't even know. I mean, me being the layman of the whole thing, we don't even know for sure if we got it right in the first place. We did do it. So I mean, to preserve it to start with.
Well, with Egyptian, we can be pretty sure we've got it pretty clearly because
because Egypt is still alive. I mean, because
they don't speak that language in Egypt anymore.
But they
speak Arabic.
Ancestry that is able to at least give a large portion of the. But in any case, that's just an example I use because that's the one that I can think of real quick. But the symbolism, for example, the Japanese, you said you had like several different ones, and one of them is like 6,000 characters.
Kanji, yeah, which is largely borrowed from Chinese characters.
I mean, so these characters and stuff like that, if these are lost, I mean, this is something that, prehistory, cavemen were making symbols and learning how to communicate with each other that way. So to lose this would be sort of a scientific death in a sense, and if you were able to preserve the current ones and decipher some of the ancient ones, it'd make it easier for the future of reading ancient languages. 1,000 years from now, we would be able to still understand.
Well, here's an interesting speculation. At some point, AI may get good enough to understand any language, both written and spoken. Then you could just make an AI that is fluent in the language and make as many copies of it as you want, preserve them as long as you want.
That's true. I didn't even think about AI. I suppose a program that can learn how to play chess without being previously programmed with any databases could also.
Oh, I think this is a much harder problem than that. But
yeah, but I mean,
because language has all these nuances and
right.
It's also only defined by the database in some sense.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm just saying, I mean, like in a sense, chess is kind of like a language too. Like math is kind of.
Chess is referring to an 8x8 board, right? It's
well,
the referents are so simple.
Math is a language, kind of, and computers are really good at math. So.
Well, they're just starting to get good at symbolic math. Even then, you sometimes have to make Mathematica see the obvious by beating on it a little bit, but. It's I think that we'll get to the point eventually where the natural language understanding, which includes all the referents of the language, which be the nouns and verbs, which have to a human have physical meaning, right? They sensory meaning. Even cuss words, which come from a different part of the human brain than normal language. Those kinds of things can eventually be absorbed into a very sophisticated. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're quite a ways off. But
we had a talk at work recently by an AI expert who's working on this problem of natural language processing, but not with an eye towards kind of solving practical problems like translating documents or transcribing audio. Those are things that AI systems are now very good at that sort of task, using sort of kind of brute force approach that does not like really involve understanding the language. And so this guy is kind of interested from a more linguistic kind of perspective, where you want to try to you could imagine a sentence. You might have some huge number of possible ways of kind of diagramming that sentence. This is the subject, this is the verb, this is the direct object, the indirect object, and relating that to some sort of database you have of what things could mean, or like how the semantics of the language would work. So he's kind of interested in this problem. But from his talk, I got the sense that people are like not at all close to solving this. But B, it's like, how do you even know when you've solved it, right? Like,
right. Well, you have to have experts on both languages say, yeah, you got it. But
or you find yourself retreating to these kind of like old-fashioned behaviorist ideas from cognitive science psychology. The idea like, well, the machine that can interact with the world as if it understands the language, thereby proves that it understands the language. Like somehow, if the machine is able to order a cup of coffee and gets back a cup of coffee, then that's the proof that it understands. Like.
Well, I'll be more impressed when it drinks a cup of coffee and tells you whether it liked it or not. But,
right.
But anyway, I do think there's a lot of reasons, both kind of science fiction, far-fetched, and historical and scientific reasons to make an effort, at preserving languages in this sense. And we have already shown examples like we're preserving Old English, for example, through old ancient literature and whatnot. So I mean,
but so in the pre-show discussion thread, Nick raised the idea of, so how are you going to preserve these things? Is it so important that you're really going to like pay, if there's like a language that only 100 people speak, are you going to like pay them money to keep speaking that language instead of switching to English?
No, I propose the idea that, I mean, worst case scenario, I'm somebody who's a historian and or anthropology.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the word I'm trying. My mouth doesn't. My brain hears it. My mouth doesn't. I have a problem with speech or something.
You're an AI. Is
I'm
that
an
what you're telling me?
archaeologist. Anthropologist. So I'm one of those people that are scientifically and historically kind of nerdy, and I think it's important to preserve these things. But I'm not going to pay somebody to preserve it. I'm going to be a scholar of this, and I'm going to do whatever I can. I do think it's important for the people who are speaking the language to want to be able to continue their language and just
well, even if you had unlimited resources, I
mean, to teach it to their children and stuff like that, unless these particular people are dying out altogether, that's a little bit different. But I don't think we should jump through any hoops. But I think it's important to recognize that there are these languages that would be good.
Well, even if I were a trillionaire, I don't know how I would save Scots Gaelic. Because you don't want to just say, okay, you 1,000 people here, I'll pay you a nice income to speak Scots Gaelic to each other. That doesn't really save the language. That's just, it's not part of their lives. It's just a way of making a living.
Just continue to have babies and teach your kids how to speak the damn thing. It's as simple as that. If you don't, then you're losing the language. So if you see that going on as an anthropologist, anyway, a historian, you might want to try and do it yourself in some ways. Record them speaking it, and try to learn the language written and do it that way. But if you're a trillionaire, you might want to give a few people a few $100 here and there. Say, I want you to continue to do something with it. But anyway, other than that, I don't think you should jump through any hoops personally, unless you are one of those people.
It reminds me of the guy, I'm blanking on his name, but there was this musical historian who in the 1920s, I want to say, went around, hill country, Appalachia and everywhere, recording country music, basically, bluegrass. And I think he recorded Robert Johnson playing blues, and it was like an invaluable contribution to musical history. But it's kind of a thankless task.
Well, the great Hungarian composer Bela Bartok did that in Hungary and Romania too. Just went around recording folk songs everywhere, and incorporated them into his own work. And
right. In some sense, that's the true way to preserve it, is to conjoin it with something living, a living musical tradition or a living linguistic tradition. Pick up the slang from random languages and start using it and hope it catches on. That's that makes it alive again in some way.
Well, Bartok did that. He wrote lots of pieces, and those pieces are preserved now, and anybody with enough skill can play them. And
they're tough. Those are tricky ones.
Yeah.
Bartok.
So I think we're going over the same thing. So I think it's like 2 or 3 things, like scientific, 3 or 4 things: scientific, anthropological.
Okay,
anthropological. Thank you. Anthropological. I got to say, I'm sorry. I have a speech problem. Anthropological, historical, scientific, future reference, possible communication with peoples of unknown, as of yet to be communicated with. I think it's an important thing to do without jumping through any hoops.
Well, there may be some hoops to jump through, but it might be worth it, right? I mean,
as far as Nick is concerned, about putting money into it, I don't think that's.
Well,
really...
let's say somebody figured out a program by which they could decipher some of these old Mediterranean languages, but they was going to take, several $1 million and a lot of hours of effort. It might well be worth it.
Well, there's some money put into computer language programming and stuff like that. Yeah, I imagine.
No, I mean, just whatever it takes. It might be archaeological expeditions, but whatever it takes. If just to decipher some of these old languages that are lost. We have the writing, but we don't know the language anymore. It might be worth it to spend that money.
It goes back into the science of anthropology. I mean, it's
it's not just anthropology. It's right. It's understanding our cultural heritage better.
Right. Yeah. I mean that's become an interest in me for the last couple 10 years or so. I suddenly became interested in it.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
where I came from.
let's see. I think Nick is temporarily checked out here. He'll be
he's
back
gonna go
shortly.
back.
By the way, if you're a viewer, and we have must be several thousand viewers right now. Oh no, it's 2. Okay. If you have any questions or comments, Patrick is monitoring.
Yeah, it's Mike Bowler, and that's really the only one, because the other 2 are me and Sam.
Oh, okay. Well, Mike Bowler, if you have any questions or comments, shoot them through the chat. We'll get them.
So Nick, while you were gone, we decided we don't like the idea of paying people to speak languages because we think it's kind of fake. But
So but there is one other thing that we could do to keep a language alive after a fashion, I should say, which is if the general artificial intelligence could be brought to the point of linguistic mastery, artificially intelligent systems could be programmed to speak dying or marginal languages, and to keep them updated as living languages, engaged with the world, and so they don't just die out completely.
well, that last step sounds even harder than the first step. Like, because you'd have to have these AIs speaking these things to each other. And
well, why just turn them on and flip the switch, right?
Well, why wouldn't they choose to, directly communicate in binary or some natural, some more
because
natural...
we force them.
we don't give them an Ethernet cable. We just give them a speaker and a microphone.
You just want to
the
computers and hope that there's no bad consequences from that.
You know about the Star Trek episode on that, right? The binars.
No.
Star Trek is still a thing.
The people that depended on a supercomputer and they actually was able to speak real quick to each other. They came in pairs. They came out to the Enterprise. They had to they used their Enterprise's computer to download their stuff, and because something was going to happen, there was a EM pulse or something that was going to happen from a star's flare or something that was going to wipe out the computer, and they had to preserve it. And these 2 people these binars came onto the Enterprise in pairs. And they spoke to each other real fast, like in a really strange computer, like kind of like, but they were able to speak English.
Well, everybody in Star Trek Galaxy speaks English.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. Yeah, it's the universal translator.
Well, they have a Babelfish. You know about the Babelfish, right?
Babelfish.
Babelfish.
You can buy that from Google Play Store right now.
What's that?
The Babelfish is now a product,
Oh yeah, there have been various things that are called themselves Babelfish, but you need an actual fish. It goes in your ear, and it's very tiny. It just squiggles in there and take care of it. And
in the other sci-fi, they would inject something in your ankle or your leg.
Which is where your ears are, presumably.
No.
Why would it be where you can hear or speak?
Hang on, I'm going to look at my videotapes. I'll tell you.
No, that's what. I'm sorry, but it's already been invented. It's called the Babelfish, and
what's the origin of that term and that idea?
The Tower of Babel.
No, well, I mean, is there a specific origin of Babelfish?
Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Okay, that's what I was looking.
Well, he was making fun of the fact that almost all science fiction has everybody speak English to each other, even though they're across the galaxy, right? So he made fun of that by saying, well, obviously it's because there's this animal that thrives on brainwaves, and it translates them into sound for everybody.
It was Farscape, where an astronaut gets caught in some kind of weird wormhole or something and ends up on the other side of the galaxy, and he ends up on this living ship.
And they all speak English.
And no, he couldn't understand anything they were saying, but he got in. They stabbed him with something in his ankle or his leg, and all of a sudden he was able to understand everybody.
Yeah. Well, I actually quite enjoyed Farscape. But it was, that's kind of It has to be. It's not a fish. I'm not convinced.
I got some of it on the videotape. One of the most amazing things was, first of all, it came from the Jim Henson Studios. While the Hynerian was just an ordinary Muppet, the really cool one was the pilot. The pilot, when you saw the pilot, this is a Muppet.
Yeah.
But you were convinced that you were looking at a creature through the whole science.
No,
fiction.
You were convinced of that, Patrick. I knew it was a Muppet.
I mean, I knew it was a Muppet, but just the visual of it, it looked alive. It was
pretty. It was well done. But I mean, the whole idea, science fiction. This trope is that no matter where you are in the galaxy, or you could be in another galaxy, everybody knows the same language and can speak to each other, which is kind of that was obvious thing for Douglas Adams to make fun of. So he invented the Babel fish, and you just stick it in your ear, and boom, you can understand Vogon poetry, which is probably the worst thing that could ever happen to you. But
there's a lot of probably a topic for another day, but there's some, in addition to SETI, another theme of this podcast on occasion is paranormal phenomena, and there are interesting paranormal phenomena related to language as well, which we could perhaps table for a future episode. I'm thinking of xenoglossy, glossolalia, which is like
glossolalia. I'm well familiar with. Yes, I've experienced it. Well, I've done it myself, but I've known lots of people have. Yeah.
Right. You live down south, right? So.
Yeah, my mother spoke in tongues.
Yeah.
And she only didn't do it often, but she did do it. And but for her, it was not paranormal. For her, it was, it was religious.
One could imagine that the original biblical inspiration was some sort of paranormal.
I've witnessed enough of that to doubt that there's anything paranormal about it.
Xenoglossy, on the other hand, is the phenomenon whereby the putative paranormal phenomena in which a person is able to speak or write a language he could not have acquired by natural means.
Yeah,
I mean, like a real language as opposed to speaking.
Some guy, say some Inuit guy grows up, completely isolated from Western languages, but somehow speaks fluent Japanese or fluent German or something. Never met a German person, never encountered a German book, but I have no idea if there are any remotely credible.
Well, those glossolalia sometimes make those claims, and in fact, there are people who have said that they were converted to Christianity by a spontaneous episode of glossolalia that was their native tongue, and the person who spoke it could never have learned the native tongue of that person who was converted.
I'm pretty sure it's just an extremely exaggerated version of what, for example, I went through. I was working at an electronics store, let's put it that way. And of course, there was this Chinese food store next door, and we get these customers coming in every now and again. And it's not like I spoke the language or anything, but for some reason, my brain clicked to the Chinese language somehow, and we used to have to ask the customer's name. And I spoke his name properly in Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And like he looked at me like I was like, yeah, that's it. Like, how did you know that? In other words, it's an exaggeration, but it's because being right next door to a Chinese food and go and get Chinese food every now and again, hearing the language, my brain, without even realizing it, my brain must have registered at least the accent or the intonation or something. And when I saw the name spelt out in English characters, I just pronounced it. And I pronounced it in a Chinese way. I don't know how my mouth just did it, but apparently my brain was training itself. But that's not like I never heard it before. It's just that it just clicked. Sometimes it just clicked.
Yeah. Well, we all have, when we're little, we all have this tremendous ability to pick up language, and maybe some of it sticks around. Who knows?
Unfortunately for all of us here, I think the best research I've read on this says no, it doesn't. It's like after 12 years old, your host. You know.
Well, yeah. I mean, I sort.
Well, I mean, let's face it. I was looking at his name spelt out in English characters, and I was, we were working next door to a Chinese restaurant, so we heard the language. So it's not like I spoke the entire language. I spoke this guy's name.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that our brains are adapted to pick up on linguistic patterns. It's definitely like a universal human adaptation.
Yeah. Well, I remember when I was 9 years old and we went to Germany. It felt very natural to start speaking German around to people around me, even though my German wasn't very good, but it didn't seem like an all complicated or difficult thing to do. And then when I was in college and I took German as an academic course, it was much more painful. I had to really work at it, and I never really became fluent. And that was, if you've been take a 9-year-old in another country for 3 weeks, he's going to start being fluent.
Mm-hmm.
You put a 19-year-old in the same country for 3 weeks, he's still going to be struggling.
Right. Starting from infancy up until early teens, the language is, it's just part of growth. It's part of actually, exploration. When the infant is looking around, that's the first thing it's learning. It's learning how to communicate. And the brain is just absorbing the sounds. That's why kids nowadays around here, for example, you have kids that are speaking 3 languages fluently in the household because their parents are speaking Spanish and something else and English.
Mm-hmm.
To them it's nothing because they grew up with this since they were infants.
Okay, I think we're going to start wrapping it up here. You guys want to do recommendations? Let's do recommendations. I know I kind of surprising you with that, but I don't mind. I mean, I think just whatever you've been listening to or reading lately, just let us have some idea. Who wants to start?
Well, I have something to hand. You caught me up short. I wasn't expecting to recommend anything, but I will recommend the set of lectures I am listening to now, which is The History and Achievements of the Islamic Golden Age from the Teaching Company, or I think they call themselves the Great Courses now. The lecturer is Ibn Giron, and I'm about 10 lectures in, and it's pretty enjoyable. It's not the greatest set of lectures I've ever heard, but it is. I've learned a lot from it, and I suspect I'll learn a lot more before it's finished.
All right, I'll go next. I'm reading, among other stupider things, my current nonfiction project is Warren Treadgold's History of the Byzantine State and Society, trying to learn about the Eastern Roman Empire. It's okay so far. I'm not that far. I'm still like in the year 400 AD, so a long way to go. But I've learned a lot about Constantine and early Christianity, which is quite interesting. But
are you familiar with Ostrogowski's classic work on the history of the Byzantine state?
I believe that this volume was specifically recommended by a blog as an alternative to that one.
Right, because that's the older one. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, I mean I've heard of that book, but I haven't read it. So.
Well, since you made me pull this one out of a hat, I'm going to recommend a mystery writer, the fiction mystery writer, Patricia Cornwell, the Scarpetta series.
The name sounds familiar. Is she quite popular?
The Scarpetta factor. It's a whole. Scarpetta she's a mortician, or she's more than a mortician. She works kind of like for the government, mortician type of thing. But anyway, it's murder mysteries and stuff like that. It's a whole series. Patricia Cornwell, I like her a lot.
Sounds good.
Okay. I guess that leaves me. I'm going to recommend a podcast because that's the sort of thing I do, and of course I already recommended a number of them. We recently had the Scientific Odyssey. Gosh, I can't remember his name. But this scientific odyssey guy on it, but I recently came across another podcast, which I'm gonna
Chad Davies. You're thinking of.
Chad Davies. Yeah, of course, that goes without saying that I recommend Chad Davies' podcast because I asked him to be on the show, right? So, but another one I'm going to recommend is much weirder and a little, and it won't be to everyone's taste, but it's called Desert Oracle. Gosh, I don't remember. I don't even know the guy's name. But it's kind of like Newsom, Lake Wobegon from the desert with lots of weird stuff. You just have to listen to it. It's very amusing, even if you don't buy into the woo-woo nonsense that he sometimes promotes. But it just has this feel and this mood to it that I really like.
What's the name again?
The Desert Oracle Radio. And so check it out. I'll put a link to the show notes. We'll put links to all these in the show notes. Bishop Cornwell and whatever else you guys, just send me a link. I'll put it in there. Okay, this is we're going to wrap up now. This has been episode 91 of the Unseen Podcast. Go to unseenpodcast.com for more information. And you could be, by the way, you could be on the panel for our future Unseen Podcast. Not for the next one or 93, but 94 you could be on, and that's going to be in July. You could be on that panel if you join us, and just go to unseenpodcast.com with all the information about how you get on there. You can follow us on Twitter at Podcast Unseen. There are many ways to keep track of us. We no longer have the subreddit, but we do have lots of other ways you can get in touch with us. We also have you can email us at unseenpodcast@gmail.com and let us know what you think, or just say I'd like to be on the panel. What do I have to do? And what you have to do is basically join the community on Google Plus, and then when it's your turn to be on a panel, you'll get an invitation, which basically every episode you'll get an invitation, and then engage with the pre-show discussion about what the show should be about, and then you'll get an invitation to be on the show. It's usually Friday nights at 10 o'clock Eastern, but that's negotiable. Okay, so we have had some on other times and other dates. So let's and also coming up in June, we also have the Unseen Pub, which anyone can participate in. Just let me know if you want to be on it. As long as there's a seat in the pub, you can come in and we can talk about whatever you want. You can come and go as you please. It's really very informal and basically no requirements for participating. And so that's that. This is episode 91. It is still just barely the 25th of May, 2018. Happy Towel Day. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.